Throughout history, the rise and fall of economies have always had profound effects on civilizations. But there was one economic crash, a crash so powerful that it didn't just shape the financial landscape, it changed the course of history. What if I told you that the first true economic collapse, the one that set the stage for all the crashes to come, happened thousands of years ago? And what if I told you that the impact of this crash still echoes in the world we live in today? Long before stock markets, banks, and modern currencies, the world's first economic crash took place in ancient Mesopotamia around 3,000 years ago. You might be thinking, how could ancient economies even resemble what we know today? But the truth is, the foundations of our current financial systems can be traced back to the fall of the very first economies. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and Babylonians had established thriving trade networks using a system of bartering and eventually metal coins to facilitate exchanges. Everything seemed prosperous, with cities booming and trade flourishing. But hidden beneath the surface, there were deep flaws in the system flaws that would eventually lead to the first economic crash in recorded history. The crisis started when rulers began to heavily borrow from temples, lending money to fund wars, projects, and personal luxuries. The concept of debt was nothing new, but the scale at which it was being applied was unprecedented. As loans accumulated, the amount of interest due grew faster than the actual economy could support. But here's the secret. The ruling elites weren't the ones suffering. It was the common people, farmers, merchants, and laborers who were left to bear the brunt. Their lands were seized to cover the debts of the elite, their properties lost to creditors. The economic collapse happened when the temples, the lenders, could no longer sustain the level of debt. The cycle of borrowing and rising interest rates reached a tipping point, and the whole economy came crashing down. This crash was more than just a collapse of money, it was a collapse of trust. The people lost faith in the rulers and the institutions that had once promised prosperity. Trade halted, and cities fell into chaos. The result was a dramatic shift in power. As debts were wiped away, the common people were left with little, and the elite were forced to rebuild an economy from the ashes. The Sumerian economy never truly recovered, but the lessons learned from that first crash would forever change the way empires viewed their economy. This economic collapse set the stage for the rise and fall of future civilizations. It wasn't the last crash, but it was the first that taught humanity an important lesson: economic stability is fragile, and unchecked greed and borrowing can destroy entire societies. The crash in ancient Mesopotamia was the first domino to fall, but its consequences reverberated through history, shaping the way future economies would function. By learning from their failures, future civilizations tried to create systems that would prevent another collapse, systems that would become the building blocks of modern finance. The most significant change came in the way rulers approached debt. In the aftermath of the Mesopotamian crash, the concept of debt forgiveness was born. Kings and rulers realized that in order to restore faith in their economies, they needed to make difficult decisions that involved forgiving large amounts of debt. This practice of debt cancellation became a key tool in preventing further economic collapse. But the lessons learned were not applied consistently. As civilizations grew more complex, the temptation to borrow and spend without limit grew as well. In the Greek and Roman empires, economic crashes became more frequent, culminating in the Roman currency crisis in the 3rd century AD, where rampant inflation and massive debt brought the Roman Empire to its knees. The key difference between ancient civilizations and the modern world, however, is the scale. What started as a localized collapse in Mesopotamia soon grew into an international concern as global trade routes expanded. The crash of one economy, whether with Rome or later, the collapse of the Dutch tulip bubble in the 17th century had ripple effects that sent shockwaves through the world, as markets became more interconnected. Fast forward to the 20th century, and we see how the lessons from ancient collapses still echo. The 1929 stock market crash, the Great Depression, and even the 2008 financial crisis all share common threads. Debt-fueled speculation, corrupt financial systems, and the manipulation of currency created conditions ripe for a crash. But what made the first crash so pivotal was its warning. It showed that an economy built on overconsumption, unchecked lending, and an imbalance of wealth would inevitably lead to collapse. And while we may have improved on certain aspects of financial regulation, history has a way of repeating itself. The crash of 2008 showed us that modern economies are still vulnerable to the same forces that toppled the first ancient civilizations. So, what have we really learned? The first crash shaped history by exposing the fragility of economic systems that still operate on borrowed time. What happens when history repeats itself and we face another global collapse? Will we learn from the past, or are we doomed to make the same mistakes? The ancient crash in Mesopotamia wasn't just the end of a civilization, it was the beginning of a cycle. A cycle that would repeat over and over throughout history, from the fall of Rome to the modern financial crises we still experience today. The question is, why does history keep repeating itself? The reality is that the same forces that caused the first economic crash are still at play in today's world. The most terrifying part? We haven't learned from the past. In fact, we've built an entire global system that is more susceptible to collapse than ever before. Today, we live in a world where global economies are deeply interconnected, where the collapse of one market can trigger a chain reaction that impacts billions of people across the globe. But these connections aren't just about trade. They're about power. The world's most powerful financial institutions have learned to use the global economy as a game, and they're the ones holding the cards. Let's look at the rise of multinational corporations. Much like the kings and rulers of ancient empires, these corporations have figured out how to control entire economies. They don't just operate within borders, they span across continents, manipulating markets, governments, and consumers alike. And just like the Sumerian rulers who borrowed heavily from temples, these corporations use debt as their primary tool to fuel their growth. But instead of kingdoms, it's companies like Amazon, Apple, and Goldman Sachs that wield the power. In the 21st century, central banks continue to print money out of thin air, with the Federal Reserve in the US and the European Central Bank holding unprecedented power. The primary difference between these modern-day institutions and their ancient counterparts? Technology. Central banks no longer just control currency, they control the flow of global trade, the value of international assets, and the livelihood of billions of people. The question is, who controls them? The answer lies in the same power structure that existed centuries ago, the elite few. We saw this system fail in 2008 when the housing bubble burst, dragging down entire economies. But what's different now? In many ways, the system is even more fragile than it was before. The wealth gap has grown, debts have skyrocketed, and inflation continues to erode the value of money. The more interconnected our world becomes, the more vulnerable we are to a global collapse. The first economic crash in history wasn't just a financial failure, it was a lesson, one that shaped the future of economies worldwide. It taught us that the pursuit of unchecked wealth, the accumulation of debt, and the concentration of power in the hands of the few can tear down entire civilizations. But here's the real question. Will we heed the warning, or will we fall into the same traps that have claimed so many before us? As we look at the global economy today, the signs are there: the rising debt, the instability in markets, and the ever-growing wealth gap. It's not a matter of if, but when the next crash happens. The first economic crash shaped the world. Will the next one do the same? If you want to dive deeper into the history of economic crashes and learn how they shaped the world we live in today, hit subscribe. Together, we'll uncover the secrets of history's most powerful financial collapses and ask the hard questions about our future. The truth is out there. Are you ready to face it?